Hello everyone and welcome back to ESPS15 Political Economy. Earlier in the year, I talked about the median voter model, and in one of the applications we talked about the Senate and how a guy called Joe Manchin, the senator from West Virginia, Democrat, is the median voter in the Senate and therefore one of the pivotal players for sort of policymaking in the US. And if you have followed American politics, you will have noticed that he indeed played a key role sort of in the passing of the stimulus bill. But not necessarily in the way that lots of people on the left wanted him to play, of course. He is basically single-handedly responsible for, well, actually with a couple other people, but he's sort of the decisive vote on basically removing sort of the minimum wage component, and also to make sure that the actual unemployment benefits that are going to be paid are lower than was originally planned. This has caused a lot of sort of rage, of course, in the Democratic Party, but it is exactly what the median voter model would predict. Basically, Joe Manchin can dictate policy outcomes at the moment. But that's not our topic today. Our topic today is veto players, and I think it will shed some light on why I think the sort of the stimulus bill that has been passed in the US has some provisions that are really, really important, for example, relating to child tax credit, and why also, if you think back a few years, why the sort of Obamacare, the sort of the provision of healthcare for Americans was such a big deal, and why it has never been repealed, despite sort of repeated attempts by the Republicans to do so. So, what explains the survival of Obamacare, and what explains this policy stability? If you think about sort of comparative politics or constitutional law in a single country, or even in a comparative politics kind of contest, there's sort of traditional views to think about sort of these different types of systems. Basically, think about sort of presidential versus parliamentary systems. So, is there an independently elected president who is not accountable to Parliament, for example, right? Or bicameralism versus unicameralism. So is there a second chamber, like the House of Lords in the UK or the Bundestag Bundesrat in Germany? So second chambers. You can think about federalism. Some countries are unitary states, like the UK or France, and some countries are federal states, like Germany or the United States. Or you can think about constitutional courts. So some countries have constitutional courts who are able to review legislation and sort of check whether that's in line with the written constitution. And in some countries these powers are strong, and in some countries these powers are weak. The veto player model that we're going to be talking about today basically provides a unified framework to think about these kinds of sort of constitutional provisions, because all of these different aspects, federalism, bicameralism, presidential versus parliamentary systems, constitutional courts, all of these are essentially sort of checks and balances on what is possible, on policy change, if you want. And today we're going to be learning about veto player theory, and basically veto player theory lets us abstract away from these names, from the exact source of their power and the exact constitutional provisions and what we call this, if we call it the second chamber, or if we call it the constitutional court, or whatever it is, and think about, if we have information about the positioning of these players, and we need their agreement, we can basically make predictions about what kind of policy change is possible. And that, of course, lets us answer sort of our big questions about sort of what policy outcomes are produced by sort of a given set of preferences and institutions, a positive question about like how the world works, or normative questions, what kind of institutions should we use to aggregate preferences? These kind of questions, of course, we've touched upon before. So let's get started with veto player models. So what is a veto player? Well, a veto player is basically an individual or collective political actor who can veto policy or legislation. So either a person or a group of people whose approval you need in order to pass laws. And they come in basically sort of two flavors in a way. So there's institutional veto players. These are actors who are sort of empowered by the Constitution, for example, like a second chamber or like a constitutional court or like a president. And sometimes they are partisan veto players. So if you think about coalition governments, for example, in order to pass any law, basically the prime minister doesn't just need the agreement of her sort of own party, but also the agreement of the coalition parties, of the junior partners in the coalition. And so the leaders of the junior parties, for example, would be basically veto players, so they can threaten to end the government or just not pass the legislation, of course. So what are examples of veto players? In the US case, we have plenty. We have the president, we have the House pivot and the Senate filibuster pivot, so the two sort of core legislators, if you want. In the EU, this is another system for which sort of veto player models as a predictive tool are used widely. Very popular sort of for modeling decision making because it's quite complicated for so many countries. So in the EU, depending on the type of decision procedure, of course, it will be sort of the Commission, then the European Parliament median voter, right, median legislator, and the pivotal member state in the European Council. Of course, when we use these kinds of models to make predictions for outcomes, sometimes the outcomes don't exactly match the predictions, and it's important to keep in mind that there's sometimes a bigger game. There are of course side payments and power and manipulation. So even if your prediction for, I don't know, some EU directive on transport policy, predicts a certain outcome and doesn't quite match it, it is worthwhile to think about, okay, sort of what, how was this decision actually arrived at? Is there bribery, for example, between countries where Germany says, okay, we want this transportation policy initiative passed, and we give you, money through some other structural funds or something. So of course, politicians are very good at sort of wielding these instruments of power. But the interesting thing about veto players, of course, is from a comparative perspective that there's huge variation between countries, across countries. In the UK, there are barely any constraints on what the prime minister with a large majority can do. So in some conditions, some years, when there's, for example, a coalition government, as we've seen in the sort of 2010-2015 period, there's of course a second veto player, partisan veto player, right? But at the moment, the power of Boris Johnson and his party is basically unchecked. They can implement any kind of policy they want without much ado, because the House of Lords ultimately cannot block legislation, and the Queen, well, in theory, being a veto player, because the royal assent is necessary. This of course has not been used in that way in a very long time. So in some countries, basically unchecked executive power, or legislative power, and in some countries you have tons of veto players. If you think about the US case, with the Supreme Court thrown in, with maybe federal provisions depending on the state, and same for Germany, for example, or other countries. So huge institutional variation, and we can reduce this complexity of the institutional variation of these names that are given to these veto players by looking at these as sort of individual veto players, and basically counting the number of veto players and what kind of positions they take in the sort of ideological space, and then making predictions based on that. So let's look at what the veto player model would look like in a two-dimensional policy space. So let's say there are three actors whose sort of agreement is required to pass a law. Player A, B, and C, and they are located in some two-dimensional ideological space. These can be sort of these abstract ideological spaces that we talked about when we talked about sort of voting, and we can think of sort of as the sort of economic and the liberal authoritarian dimension. But we can think also of these in, if we apply this to concrete sort of policy context, to much more specific kind of questions on like spending and sort of rigor of environmental protections or something. So what we need is sort of the positions of these actors in the relevant policy space for the question at hand. So we have three players here, maybe the parliament, the president, and the second chamber, right? And so what is the prediction then? How can we use this? Well, one way to think about this is we have the positions of the players as they are now, but that is not quite enough to make a sharp sort of prediction. In many cases, we have already an existing policy status quo. So there's some existing policy that is sort of in the upper right region here, right? And we have these three veto players. So what can we then infer from this? What can we learn from this? Well, we have already learned about, of course, indifference curves. I think when we talked about voting models. And basically what we can do is we can draw, for example, for player A here, we can draw what is called the indifference curve. So player A is indifferent between all points that fall exactly on this circle sort of surrounding her ideal point, her most preferred sort of policy outcome. This is the same kind of logic that we've used in the median voter kind of situation, right? So indifference curve. All the points inside the circle are preferred by A over points outside of the circle or on the circle, and she's indifferent between all outcomes exactly on this indifference curve. And this indifference curve is basically created by the ideal point and the status quo. That creates the space for improvement. So any point that is closer to A's ideal point in red, closer than the status quo, that is preferred by A. Okay. We can do then the same for player B and for player C. Okay, and I've sort of marked these indifference curves in the colors corresponding to the three players. So red for player A, blue for player B, and green for player C. And they're given basically by the positions of the actors and the status quo. Right, and what is interesting about this this sort of picture here? Okay, so we're not in sort of primary school. It's not about drawing nice circles. What is interesting here? Well, we can think about a special region that we kind of find in the middle that is created by the intersection of the indifference curves of A, B, and C, and that is basically this yellow region here. And what's special about this yellow region? Well, what's special about this yellow region is that this is the area of potential sort of policy outcomes that would make A, B, and C, all three players, better off than the status quo. So we can verify that just by sort of confirming that it lies inside their respective win sets. So all of the players would be better off by choosing a point that falls inside this yellow region, and this is what we call the win set. So this is the set of points that would beat the status quo, if you want. And this is only defined, of course, by the positions of the actors and the status quo. So without the status quo, there's no win set, right? So so we have a set of points that we would think would be able to beat, if we could agree on a policy, would be able to beat the status quo in a vote, because it's not really a vote; it's anonymity. It's an agreement between all three players in this case. So the win set is the crucial sort of question, for instance, the size of the win set, the size of the potential sort of policy outcomes. So what would our prediction here be? Well, we would have to have some sort of additional idea about what the process looks like. Maybe player B can make proposals, and A and C can just sort of vote yes or no, right? Or they can make alternating proposals. If they can make alternating proposals, we need some mechanism to model bargaining. If we have agenda setting power, like for example, player A chooses the proposes something, and then B and C can agree or not agree, what would the outcome be? Well, we've already talked about agenda setting, so you're well aware. So player A, of course, would propose something that is as close as possible to her ideal point. So sort of at the lower left end of the win set, I suppose. She would propose some point there, and B and C would agree because it beats the status quo, right? So that would be our prediction in this case. And then we would have moved to this new point. I didn't draw this, but we can think of this as sort of the new status quo. And the new status quo now falls into this kind of triangle that is sort of created by the positions of the veto players. And we call this triangle, this area, the core, or the anonymity core, or the Pareto set. And what is special about the core is basically that if the status quo the policy has sort of arrived at a point within this core, then of course there is no possibility to make everyone better off without making someone worse off. Politics turns into a zero-sum game at that point, and there's basically no potential for policy change. Once the status quo has arrived exactly at this point that I described before, inside this core, no more policy changes is possible. We would expect stability or stagnation, sort of depending on your normative kind of angle, perhaps. So no more change from a status quo that falls inside the core. So having worked through the sort of details of this for one specific case with these three players and the given status quo, we can think about sort of more general predictions of this theoretical model. Is this going to tell us something about policy stability more generally that we could apply, for example, to different sort of country contexts comparatively? The first sort of implication of this theoretical model that we can think about is what happens if we increase the number of veto players. If there's only one veto player, any outcome is possible, and the veto, the only player really, the Prime Minister in the UK, for example, will try to implement policy as close to their preferred ideal point as possible. So there's nothing much going on. But if we have more than one veto player, we can think about, so what happens if we increase the number of veto players? Does this matter? And we can think about this scenario we have here. This is from the Tsibeli's piece that you read, I think. And we can look at basically the scenario that I sketched before with the three veto players. But what happens if we add another veto player to the mix? What if we forgot that there's a constitutional court also reviewing policy? Wouldn't forget that in reality, of course. What would happen then? Well, we can introduce an additional player, player D here, and let's say player D is relatively close to the status quo. What happens to the win set in this scenario? Well, basically, what happens to the win set is that the win set gets much smaller in this scenario. So basically, there are fewer opportunities for policy change. The status quo can't move that much, or in an extreme case, can't move at all. So if you increase the number of veto players, you may end up in a situation where you basically increase policy stability, where policy change becomes more difficult. Of course, that crucially depends on the actual sort of ideological location of the veto players. Just by having more veto players sort of piled up in the same positions, for example, doesn't increase policy stability. If D was located exactly at the point A, or was located very close to B, for example, then we wouldn't see so much change, right? So it depends. The number may be important, but it depends crucially on the ideological position of these additional veto players. The second sort of implication of this theoretical model concerns ideological distance. I already said earlier on the previous slide that basically ideological distance determines whether the number of veto player matters. And this is one way to show it. Apologies for the sort of messy graph. It's not my fault. It's George Sibeli's fault. So we have the same status quo, right? And we have two sets of veto players. It's quite messy to see, I think, but once you stare at it for a little bit, you will see. There's the previous, similar to the previous scenario, veto players A1, A2, and A3, right? A big sort of triangle. So we have three veto players in that scenario. But they are quite dispersed. The ideological difference between these veto players is large. Or we have scenario 2, and that creates the win set A, win set of the status quo A, the darkly shaded area. And then we have the second scenario where we have 5 veto players, B1, B2, B3, B4, B5, creating this weird sort of shape. And in that scenario, there are more veto players, but they are more ideologically cohesive, or they're closer to each other, if you want. They are not so dispersed in terms of their ideology, and we end up with a much larger win set. So win set B is much larger than win set A. So the greater the ideological distance, the greater the smaller the win set, the more policy stability, and the more sort of concentrated these veto players are in terms of their ideological positions, the more space for policy change there is from a previous scenario, for example, from a previous status quo. The third sort of theoretical implication of this veto player model, empirical implication of this theoretical veto player model, concerns agenda setting. I already said that when I had my own sort of example in the very beginning. Basically, this is the scenario where we have two veto players, A and B. We have a status quo, we have a win set, the shaded area. Now, what is going to be the outcome? Well, if there's no agenda setting, we have to think about how the bargaining between A and B works. Maybe one of them is more patient and can sort of wait out the other player, and one is more urgently needs policy change or something. And we can think about sort of bargaining models, or we have some sort of fair bargaining model where they end up somewhere in the middle, like Nash bargaining solution or something. But if we have agenda setting, if player A makes proposals and player B can agree or disagree, right? But cannot make proposals themselves, well, what happens then? Well, then the outcome, of course, is determined by the agenda setter. So if player A has agenda setting power, what is player A going to suggest? Well, player A is going to suggest point PA, right? So they're going to suggest the point that is in the win set that is closest to their ideal point, and player B will sort of begrudgingly accept that. So PA is better for B than the status quo, narrowly. And therefore player B will agree. If player B had agenda setting power, was the one sort of proposing the legislation, for example, and player A is the one who can agree or disagree, the president or whatever, then of course we would end up at point PB. Right? So agenda setting power is another implication of the veto player model. So let's go through these sort of empirical predictions of the veto player model in turn. So the first one was number of veto players. Like I said, does the number of veto players matter per se? When looking at a specific case, the answer is no, right? Just having more doesn't really matter. The ideological distance, of course, is what matters. But perhaps if you sort of think about this sort of comparatively over many cases, many scenarios, of course, you would think that, well, if all else equal, the number of veto players might sort of on average increase stability, because they are just by chance, they're going to be more dispersed sort of over, over many cases. So looking at a specific case, that's not really an implication of the model, but if you think about this cross-nationally, probably more veto players induces more stability. Implication 2, ideological distance. So basically, the further apart the veto players are, the more stability we expect. So great, the hypothesis then that we could test, of course, would be that if there's greater ideological distance, there should be less change, less policy change, fewer laws being made, for example. The third sort of prediction based on this is kind of implied by the previous two, and that is alternation. So if there is a change in the position of the veto players, for example, because somebody new gets elected, right, then you would expect changes in outcomes. So changes in the positions and veto players should change sort of the potential outcomes that are possible in the political system. And the fourth point I just made about agenda setting. So we can make sort of sharp point prediction if we know something about the sequence, the procedure that is being used, for example, with one player proposing legislation and other players sort of just saying, yes or no. Okay. What I would like you to do now for 5 minutes or so is to pause the video after I'm done talking and think about how would you test this? How would you test these empirical implication of the theoretical sort of veto player model? How would you test it? If this was your idea for your final paper. Now, okay, that will be a pretty impressive idea for your final paper if you had come up with this before George Sibelius did. So I would be very happy, but that's not the expectation, of course, for it. But if this was your sort of original idea, how would you do it? How would you measure those things? How could you measure an independent variable, either the ideological positioning or the number of veto players or the alternation? How would you measure the outcome, the policy stability? That's the more tricky one, I think. So focus on that one. So think for a few minutes about this. So how could you measure whether this is right, whether this prediction of sort of more stability, if there are more veto players, if there's more ideological distance? How could you test if this is really true? How would you do this practically? If this was your paper and you had to work on this. So what would be the observations and how would you measure policy stability, basically? So maybe take 5 minutes, pause the video. I'm not going to have an upload function because we'll talk about some examples right away. But maybe, just sit down for a little bit by yourself and think about some ways to test this. I hope you took a couple minutes to think for yourself what would be a good way to test it. Maybe it is about the number of laws produced, or maybe it is about the some measure of sort of policy change, of course, in terms of the outcome. Okay, we will look at two applications now that basically test sort of empirically these veto player models. And the first is by Tsoubelis and Chang, 2004. And what they do is they test the effect of two parts basically of this: the ideological distance of the veto players, right, and the alternation, so change in positions over time. And both of these obviously should lead to more, less change in the case of sort of ideological distance, more, less, more policy stability, less change, yeah. And alternation, of course, should lead to more change. Yeah? So changes in the ideological positions of the veto players should induce policy change. Okay. So how do they test it? What do they do for the outcome? What's their dependent variable? What's their outcome? Well, they look at budget composition. And budgets are nice because, as Schumpeter said, the budget is the skeleton of the state, stripped of all misleading ideologies. Okay, and that's exactly what budgets are. Budgets are basically a way for us to look at what the government priorities are, and they can wax lyrically in their manifestos and in their sort of speeches to specific audiences, perhaps, and tell us that they want to lift everyone out of poverty and do the best in education and for social policy and for the environment and for transportation and trade and all the good things that they want to do. But of course, a lot of that is rhetoric. So what does the government actually do? How do they put their priorities? Do they spend an additional pound on hospitals or on policing or on environmental protection? Those are the real footprints of the government. Okay, that's why the Schumpeter quote is so good, I think. So budget composition. So changes in the budget composition is what Tsoubelis and Chang use. So how do they do it practically? So how do they measure sort of change in the budget composition practically? Well, it's quite tedious what they did. So they went and basically looked at OECD IMF database and looked at sort of these different categories and subcategories: defense, education, healthcare, social security, housing, other things. And said, okay, so what percentage of the government of the budget is spent on these different items? And that gives you, in a way, sort of a list of priorities, a multi-dimensional sort of position of the government in these different domains, a set of priorities relative to the other possible sort of spending categories. And what do they do with it? Well, they do something which sounds quite complicated, but it's really quite easy, actually. So think about it this way. Think about the budget only having sort of two categories, guns and butter. So dimension one is sort of defense spending, and dimension two is sort of social spending or something, right? So if there are these two categories only, then basically the relative percentages of these categories, the percentage of these categories in terms of the total spending of the government would be sort of a point in this two-dimensional space, right? So, for example, country A, at point T, and country A at point T plus 1 is sort of a change, right? So A at point T is one sort of budget composition, right? A lot on the first dimension, less on the second dimension, right? And then at point T plus 1, they have basically moved to spending more on the second dimension, right? And the same for country B here. We can think about sort of a change in the budget composition, right? And basically, the change in the budget composition is defined sort of by the Euclidean distance between the points in the first, sort of year to year in the first case to the next year, and that gives us basically a measure of sort of change between budgets from year to year or from budget cycle to budget cycle. Okay, people sort of understand this. So the example is for two-dimensional case, of course, but Euclidean distance, of course, generalizes to sort of an n-dimensional case. So we get a sort of for all the budget categories basically treated as individual dimensions, and we get an n-dimensional sort of measure of budget, of change in the structure of the budget over time. So what do these data, what do they look like? So what does the sort of average change in budget distance from one year to the next look like? If you look at these countries, you can kind of see a little bit what's going on here. So if you look at Austria, for example, or Germany, you see relatively little change over time. But if you look at France, for example, or what else do we have here? Spain or even the UK, we see relatively more change. So this is basically a way to condense this complexity. Should we spend an additional pound on healthcare, or on education, or what? And these changes over time, to condense these changes over time into sort of a single measure of change from year to year in terms of the government's priorities. And what they do then is basically they run a sort of regression model between the outcome, which is the sort of yearly change in the budget composition, right? The sort of core sort of outcome variable. How much variability is there in the budget from year to year? Using this variable we just sort of defined as a function of what? As a function of ideological distance, ID, and alternation. So if there's greater ideological distance, we would expect less change, and that's what we get with the negative sort of coefficients behind the ID variable. And if there's alternation in the positions of the veto players, we would expect to see sort of more change, and that's also what we find here. Okay. Let's quickly look at one more application of the veto player theory, and that is a paper by Eunji Ha in 2007. And basically what she does is she looks at sort of this debate, I guess, in sort of the globalization IPE kind of literature between the efficiency hypothesis and the compensation hypothesis. Now this is not an IPE class, so we won't spend too much time on it, but maybe you guys have heard of this already. But so basically, if you think about globalization, sort of the integration into world economy, there's basically sort of two views for what the effects of this on sort of democratic countries are. One is the efficiency hypothesis, right? And that basically says this openness to international markets basically sort of limits the government's room to maneuver. So certain policies are no longer possible. The countries cannot tax as much as they would like to. Perhaps they cannot spend as much as they would like to. They cannot have certain standards that they would like, because in terms of international competition, they need to attract investment, and therefore cannot sustain these policy choices. And that basically predicts sort of a race to the bottom in taxes, in welfare policies, in regulation, etc., due to loss of these policy tools and sort of the increasing sort of regulatory and tax competition between countries. So it assumes kind of that international trade and competition for investment is sort of like a prisoner's dilemma almost, if you want. And we end up in this sort of like low tax, low regulation, kind of scenario, low welfare state kind of scenario. Problem with this a little bit is that the data doesn't quite support this so well. Okay. What's the alternative to the efficiency hypothesis? Well, the alternative to the sort of, not to say that this is not, these are very sort of abstract level sort of theories in a way. Like there's good evidence, for example, for erosion in labor standards for certain sets of countries. So the factory disasters in Bangladesh and these kind of events, they're not by chance. So there's definitely erosion of labor standards, for example, for certain sets of countries, for certain types of sectors, but it is much more complicated. And I think overall, if you think about this sort of idea of like erosion of sort of tax competition and the erosion of sort of social spending and welfare states, that's not quite as well supported. Okay, And maybe veto players explain part of this. Huh? But what's the alternative to this efficiency hypothesis, this kind of erosion kind of story? Well, the alternative is basically this is the classic idea of sort of embedded liberalism. So in order to open up, in order to participate in the world market and reap these benefits, basically governments have to pay off the losers, right? They have to compensate the losers. And these gains from trade, from globalization, etc., are big enough to compensate. Those who lose out, for example, by working because they're working non-competitive industries or whatever it is. Okay, and so this consensus of compensating the losers so that they don't erect new trade barriers. Of course, is something we've seen play out in recent years, both in the US and in the UK. I think to some extent, if you don't provide sufficient compensation for the losers of all these sort of gains from globalization, then they will vote for a reduction in globalization, be it in terms of migration patterns, be it in terms of trade. We've seen sort of this anti-trade rhetoric, for example, in the US being very successful, and the UK also just has sort of erected enormous trade barriers, basically in response to voters who feel dissatisfied with all sorts of outcomes, basically. But that leads us sort of astray. We have these two hypotheses, basically. So the efficiency hypothesis, erosion of the welfare state, or compensation hypothesis. So the governments basically compensate the losers of globalization. But what do these imply? So what would the predictions be? Well, the predictions would basically be, if we think about this like a scatter plot, sort of cross-national over time, maybe we could think of sort of what we put in the x-axis. Well, we put sort of the openness, so how integrated a country is in the world economy, basically, and then we put sort of the, say, welfare spending or government spending on the y-axis. And so the efficiency hypothesis basically would predict sort of a negative relationship. So the more integrated the country is, the less social spending there should be. And the compensation hypothesis basically predicts the opposite. So the more integrated countries are in the world economy, the more they have to compensate the losers of globalization, if you want. So negative for the efficiency hypothesis, positive sort of relationship for the compensation hypothesis. Which is it? Let's think about it. Veto player models basically let us look at this specifically by thinking about what happens if these effects are actually conditional on sort of the ability of the government to actually affect policy change. And that's exactly what we see in this graph. So this is not a scatter plot, but it shows kind of the effects for different levels of veto or different numbers of veto players. So on the x-axis, we have capital mobility, basically a measure of globalization, of world market integration for countries. So this is cross-national work for those of you who've looked at the paper. And on the y-axis, we have welfare spending as a percentage of GDP. And what does she find? Well, she finds that basically the relationship is positive. So this is support for the compensation kind of story, right? But crucially, it depends on the sort of characteristics of the political system. If you have a political system where there are many veto players, sort of veto players equals 4 is sort of the lowest of these lines, right? Then basically the relationship is quite flat because the government is not able to institute the sort of necessary changes, right? But if you have few veto players, then the government is able to be more responsive to these needs and do something about it. It doesn't quite chime with our experience of the last 5-10 years, maybe though. What's an alternative way to think about this? Well, alternative way to think about this is, so this was the number of veto players, right? So this is the slightly cruder measure, if you want. The alternative way to measure veto players, of course, is sort of to think about their ideological distance. And this is the same analysis, but using ideological distance instead of number of veto players. And we have on the x-axis, again, sort of world market integration, capital mobility in this case. And we have on the y-axis welfare spending. And we can see, again, that sort of if you have a political system where sort of the ideological positions of these relevant actors, the veto players, the president, the Congress, Senate, or maybe Constitutional Court, etc., federal states, if these are quite dispersed, right? So ideological distance is large, right? Think about America. If there's gridlock, if the president and the one of the Senate say come from different parties, ideological distance is large, then we see little relationship as barely noticeable basically. But if they are sort of closer together, if there's unified government, for example, in the US case, we basically, so ideological distance is small, so one standard deviation, I think, below the mean is this example, then we see a sort of positive relationship between openness and welfare spending. So basically, the compensation story gets some support here, but crucially, it depends on whether the political system is actually able to sort of enact change. And this analysis, with the effect being contingent on this institutional configuration, relies, of course, on what's called interaction effects. And I'll say a couple words about this in the data analysis session later this week. So we have seen sort of the logic of the veto player model. We have seen two sort of nice, clear, easy to understand applications of the model that show that indeed sort of these institutional constraints, these veto players, are really important. And veto players in some letters basically sort of apply a unified perspective to compare this sort of enormous variety of institutional arrangements that we find cross-nationally. So countries all are different, all their constitutional provisions, all their political systems are complicated and radically different from each other if you look at the details. But basically, veto player models let us sort of abstract away a lot from these labels attached to the political actors, and just think about, okay, who do we need to get on board in order to enact change, and then identify the ideological position of these actors, and then you have yourself a ballgame prediction. Okay, and the outcome of all this, of course, of these empirical tests that you have seen, is that these institutional constraints, these veto players, the larger number of veto players and more ideological dispersion, produce greater policy stability. Now, whether policy stability is something desirable kind of depends on a little bit maybe on your politics or on your perspective. So if you're radical, maybe it is undesirable. Maybe you want radical change, and a sort of system that induces a lot of stability doesn't let you do that. And that's the logic if you think about sort of the idea of gridlock in the American context, there, where you have divided government basically between the legislature and the executive, but you find similar kind of scenarios in other countries, of course. Or if you think about German case, where there a few years ago now there was the famous word of the Reformstau, the traffic jam of reforms. No labor market reforms, for example, could be instituted because there were too many veto players basically that would stop these potential changes. But so that's sort of the perspective of, like, you want change, you want to be able to change things, but on the other hand, maybe stability is also can be a good thing. So what does stability lead to? Well, stability leads to predictability. Predictability is nice for business and for individual people. It's nice to know that the tax system and the social welfare system and the regulatory environment and maybe the trade with your largest neighbors is not going to sort of radically change overnight just because a different government comes into power. So predictability of sort of the political environment and the regulatory environment is really important if you want to well, if you're running a business or if you're just living your life. And also the idea of incremental improvements, of course, is important. So once you have a policy instituted, maybe you can learn about what does work or what doesn't work and sort of make incremental improvements, rather than sort of throw the baby out with the bathwater every time, every few elections when new parties come into power and sort of want to change everything. And that can be quite damaging to people's lives in a way. And some policy fields, for example, in the UK, education, you can think of sort of almost constant reforms and sort of changes to how things work, and that's not necessarily successful, I think. So, but whether predictability and stability is a good thing or a bad thing, like I said, depends a little bit sort of on your normative views, on your political positioning. If you want, if you're more centrist, maybe you're more a friend of stability, and if you're a radical, you're more a friend of sort of uncontrolled, unchecked government power. But that's of course up to you. We don't really do normative questions, but I thought it was interesting to think about this for a second here. So we're almost finished, and what I would like you to make sure you do by Thursday, like I said in the seminars, is make sure you sort of complete your research design documents and upload these on Moodle, and I will then over the next few weeks open up these one-on-one meeting slots for you to discuss your research designs with me. I look forward to seeing you all on Friday, and I hope you have a good week.